Welcome to Macro Minds, where I talk to economists and other experts about the issues of our time. Hello and welcome to Macro Minds. I'm your host, Kallum Pickering, Chief Economist at Peel Hunt. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Anna Leach, the Institute of Directors Chief Economist, previously Deputy Chief Economist at the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, and before that, Anna worked at the Government Economic Service for the Treasury and the Department of Work and Pensions. Anna, great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
No problem at all.
Well, let's just start off with something straightforward. I'm sure most people will have heard of the Institute of Directors, but for anyone that hasn't, could you just give us a bit of an explanation of what you guys get up to?
Absolutely. So one of our hats is we are a membership organisation for directors and their equivalents and those on a pathway. And as a membership organisation, we offer fairly standard things like office facilities in our nice pad on Pall Mall. It's got some nice restaurants. You can rent meeting rooms, all of that usual stuff. We also do professional training for board leaders as well. And actually, I'm just doing it myself.
Oh, very good.
Done a couple of the exams on the role of the director and the board. So that's a bit about us. We've got about 20,000 members as well.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so first question. UK economy. Everyone has a view. What's yours?
Well,
are we too pessimistic?
No. I am. Thing is, I'm a massive optimist.
Well, economists tend to be optimists, actually. Just to caveat this, if you get economists in a room, generally in the end, they'll say, yeah, it's probably going to be fine. The last 200 years is kind of a hockey stick, so you're betting against a lot of momentum.
I mean, that is definitely true when you think about innovation and the opportunity. But coming back into the here and now, we're not doing brilliantly. I mean, that's just a fact. We had about 1% growth last year. We're going to have about 1% growth next year. We're looking about 1% growth this year. These are not amazing numbers. Back in the olden days, trend growth was 2.5%, and a normal quarter was 0.6, 0.7, and a fantastic quarter was like 2%. Yep. Whereas now we're going, 0.7 in Q1, fastest in the G7, amazing.
Do you think it's justified to call that stagnation, though, which seems to be the prevailing narrative?
No, that wouldn't be really fair, would it? We're still growing, and there is still opportunity. We're not on a slippery slope ever downwards, are we? There is still investment happening, even in the dark times. Investment is happening. Growth is happening in the private sector. It's just not doing brilliantly, and for reasons which we understand. And it's not like we've run out of policy options, have we?
And given the problems, we'll list them in a second. What do you think a normal growth rate would be in the UK? Sort of absent the sort of echo of monetary policy tightening and the recent supply shocks and the uncertainty around global trade policy. All else equal, what do you think the run rate of the UK is at the moment?
It's probably about 1.5.
That's right.
I would say. Do you think that's? What do you think?
No, I think that's probably right, and not to make a too nuanced point to get into the weeds too quickly, but I think that there's a prevailing narrative that the UK economy has essentially been stagnating since early 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the gas shock and the Bank of England raising rates. So it's really not true. Since late 2023, we've actually, as you mentioned, we've had a bit of growth. It's not been great, but we've had a bit of growth. There's still lots of things that are probably dragging on the economy, which mean growth is lower than what it would be in a normal situation. And the wisdom that the economy is stagnating means that we lack perspective on the problems that we actually have. So we sort of assume that, we have an energy crisis and we have taxes that are too high and we have issues in various parts of the labour market and housing market, and that's given us zero growth. I think if we got a period of sort of 1.5% growth for a while, I think we'd better understand the scale of our problems, and I think people would just sort of relax a little bit. I think a lot of the view about the UK, especially in growth, is a bit outdated. It refers to that 2022-2023 period. It's not as up to date as it should be.
Yeah, I mean, just to contradict myself, though, while I've been thinking as you've been speaking, where we have been stagnating is on living standards and, of course, on productivity. So I think we have been growing, yes, but if the growth is more related to the population growing, so actually each individual isn't feeling that much better off, if at all, compared to, say, 10 years ago, then, that is an issue. And, of course, that's really why, one of the government's targets is a living standards one, albeit not a very stretching one. So it couldn't be much less stretching. But like addressing productivity, which you'd have a much stronger argument for saying that productivity has been relatively stagnant, and looking at what's going on in that space. And then that leads you into the government is trying to prioritise investment, at least in its narrative, if not in its action.
So perhaps actually that's a good start. So when it comes to government policy, there are a set of aims to be pro-growth, to be pro-business. That was certainly the ticket which Labour campaigned on and won the election fairly comfortably. Where do you think, speaking from your own perspective and your members, perceptions of government are now with respect to their aims and the kind of scorecard for the policies that they've enacted so far?
Yeah, I mean, the best place to start is probably our latest business confidence measure, or actually our most recent one, because our next one will be out on the 1st of September. But the prior one to that, we had our weakest confidence reading ever. And the data goes back to 2016. So that is not amazing. And part of that is, in relation to what the government has done versus what it said. Because as you say, they talk about growth, they talk about living standards, they talk about investment, they talk about house building, deregulation, lots of things which are helpful to the growth outlook and for confidence. But what they have done is a very significant increase in taxation on businesses. And it's both the scale and the unexpected nature of it that have hit businesses hard. Plus, there was a lengthy period of talking down the economy in the run-up to those tax decisions being made last year. And all of those sort of came together and then have come into effect from April this year to leave businesses feeling very downbeat in the here and now. It doesn't mean that as business leaders they don't see a way out for their business. There are always opportunities. But when it comes to UK domestic government policy, they are not feeling very happy. And of course, at the moment, we're seeing again tax policy ideas being tested in the news flow ahead of the budget. And I mean, that really just needs to come to an end. Yep. Really, you can't support business confidence and growth and investments by constantly squashing business confidence in their own revenue flow and demand expectations.
There's this extreme sense of foreboding, right? Every sort of 6 months, there's going to be a fiscal announcement that's going to jar economic activity. When you look at household balance sheets and behaviour and business balance sheet and behaviour, you see businesses with lots of cash in their balance sheet, they're reducing their debt levels. Same is true for households. Actually, saving is elevated relative to incomes. One argument is it's the Bank of England actually raised interest rates. It's a good old-fashioned response to higher interest rates. It's just tied to monetary policy. There's another argument that is, if businesses and households just anticipate that taxes may go up, they may start to retain earnings and income. Are you hearing that kind of thing from businesses?
I'm not hearing that they are reluctant to spend beyond hiring, which is definitely on pause, or they're doing any hiring outside of the UK. It's more that inevitably the profit hits from the tax rises, as the OBR predicted, inevitably reduces the amount of cash available for investment. So it's not like they're going, okay, I'm actively, well, I mean, I suppose they are actually. They are saying, you know, our investment plans for the year ahead are weaker than they otherwise would have been. But they're not negative people. They'll talk.
Yeah, exactly.
They'll talk positively about what they are doing. But they are mostly what they talk about in quite strident terms sometimes is the frustration with getting a sort of long-term read out of government policy. Because, you know, you've got the long-term strategies, those are great, you know, 10-year plans here, there and everywhere. But if what you do in the immediate term is unleash a really significant unexpected tax shock, that rather undermines the expectation that you can stick to these long-term plans because, you know, this came out of nowhere, or rather completely contradicts the messaging they went into the election on, which is we're only going to do 10 billion of tax and spending. And they did 70 billion of spending and 40 billion of tax. Those are very different numbers.
Yeah. And where do you think the where do you think businesses are most feeling it, with the anti-employment regulations and tax increases, or is it something just a bit more general, which is to say we had expected a pro-growth government? And I think actually it's a funny old thing, this, because I think there was a bit of an, let's call it ignorance on behalf of government, to think that because the previous Conservative government was so anti-business for the longest time in the policies that they enacted in their policy choices, that as long as you were not the previous Conservative government, you were pro-business just by your nature. But pro-business means something very specific. It means getting the incentives right to take risk, easing of regulation, so businesses can just open up parts of the economy which are currently closed off, to lower taxes. In some instances, it might even be introducing barriers to entry to protect industries that you want to grow. We've had none of that, and so there's a gap there. Is there a positive argument to say businesses were much too optimistic heading into the budget that we had last year, and perhaps they're too pessimistic heading into the budget that we have this year? What's your best guess for what we get in probably late October, early November?
Okay, there's a lot in there. No, I don't. I think they were on an optimism journey in the run up to last year's budget, where, you know, the new government had come in. I think we saw with the King's speech, all the bills that they had listed there were exactly what they said they were going to do. The employment regs was exactly what they would say they were going to do. So they may or may not have believed them when it was all the love-in with business prior to the election, but they're doing what they said they would. So they can't really claim to be surprised on that front. But from then onward, it was like a process of of talking down the economy, which businesses were very against, and testing of tax ideas, which are all very detrimental to businesses, and then going even further than was feared at the budget. This time, as I say, our confidence measure has confidence at rock bottom. I suspect, therefore, particularly from reading what some of the comments that come inside those survey results, that it can't fall any further. There's nothing. The government can do no worse now. Tax testing, more tax raising ideas. Yes, that's what we expect now, because of what they've done so far. But then I think stepping into another point you were making, which was about, I guess the challenge actually, in even trying to find my words, is the government isn't really sure what it's doing.
That's right.
What its priorities are. You can't just say your primary mission is growth, and then the first thing you do is take a load of money out of the private sector and give it to the public sector, where productivity, say NHS at that time, is 10% lower than pre-pandemic. That is not going to give you
It's anti-growth
growth.
by construction, actually, as well. Just anti-growth by construction.
Yeah, it's like it's just maths.
It's just maths.
It's like the OBR did some nice charts, just showing the quite straightforward maths.
I would just say here, let's just for a second just be two economists complaining. When economists point things like this out, there's often a perception that it's a preference that we have that this is the way the world is. Like, no, this is just it's a matter of fact. Actually, if you have a chunk of the economy that's less productive than the part that you're taxing, and you transfer resources and income, your overall level of productivity just has to come down.
Yes,
by definition.
Yeah, and exactly. I mean,
it's an identity, actually.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're absolutely right. And obviously, economists are much maligned at the best of times. But I mean, it's a lot of things are proceeding exactly as the OBR had foreseen, but worse, going the same direction, but worse. But elements of that are because, economic modelling, as I say to people, it's really, really hard, as you will know as well. It is hard to predict these things. You don't know when things are going to be multiplicative or additive. You can't pick the threshold for a minimum wage increase, which is absorbable versus unabsorbable, because it varies firm to firm. So it's not the easiest job, but I mean, the policies that have been enacted to date have had a very predictable results. It was going to be detrimental to growth further out. The OBR said it would be. In the near term, it's just how much will government spending step into support. And I think you've seen that in some of the latest data, actually, a bit of a pickup in government consumption as business investment and consumer spending tick down. It's like, yes, because money been taken from here to put over here. Yep. Despite the savings point, which you rightly made. And I know there's been a lot of speculation about why nobody is spending these savings, and the Bank of England have done loads of work about how people might spend the money they've accumulated through a one-off weird event like COVID.
Yep.
And of course, there's differences across different household types and firms type, which can explain the pace at which at a macro level the money gets spent. As you say, interest rates have been higher. Obviously, they've been going down, but then it's the real interest rate, isn't it, that really matters?
Yeah. And then you have these weird lag effects, right? The Bank of England said in August, probably the monetary policy is actually at its tightest now, and then you'll start to see this easing, which is difficult. I mean, the difference between the private sector and the public sector is the private sector has the capacity to borrow and spend. The public sector doesn't, and yet it's the public sector which seems to be straining its balance sheet so much to try and generate growth. I mean, this is a great contradiction at the heart of the UK economy. I mean, I would hazard a guess, actually, if government were to just, and this won't happen, just so that any listeners are clear, suddenly say, actually, we're just going to, as quickly as possible, balance the budget, no matter how. The first effect would, of course, be negative because you would have a big cut in spending. The second effect would be borrowing costs would come down significantly across the curve, and you would have less purchase of scarce resources in the economy. And then the private sector would benefit from lower borrowing costs, more resources, and would then just set about and grow. And there are times when you should be very fearful of austerity, after the global financial crisis, during a balance sheet recession, but an economy at full employment with healthy private sector balance sheets, 1-2% of GDP of austerity over 3 or 4 years is not something that you should be very worried about, especially when you would expect to see interest rates come down across the government curve. But it's there's a great deal of reluctance to follow these kind of policies on both sides of politics. I mean, the Conservatives were much the same. My question is, okay, so getting into the detail of the budget, you'll have an updated OBR forecast. For this year, I think the OBR had 1% growth. Is that right? And then next year was about 1.9.
Around 2 for next year.
So this year's probably a bit too low, but not much. Let's say maybe a 1.3, 1.4, something like that. They'll be a little bit optimistic. They always are.
That is true.
Next year will be brought down a little bit. Let's say they go for 1.6, 1.7. Then it's sort of 1.7, 1.8. They might have to bring down the productivity assumption a bit. But the growth forecast's really not going to force the government to. It won't create a huge black hole. Borrowing so far this fiscal year seems to be roughly in line with the OBR forecast.
Yep.
what's the OBR's ready reckon? I'm just trying to work through the maths here with you. What is it? A 1 percentage point rise in average borrowing cost adds about 25 billion to borrowing, doesn't it? 10-year rates are roughly where they were in March. 30-year rates are 30 basis points higher. So it's actually hard to just arrive at the budget and say we should be very, very worried about tax increases or something like that. And yet the headlines are 50 billion in tax increases, 1976. And kind of crisis. And for me, this is the really interesting point about the UK. We say, okay, it's not great when you look at the facts. But the narrative is just so much worse. How do we reconcile this? What happens in your mind that changes this state of world?
I think the challenge is differentiating between how things are and how things will be and how they could be. Yeah. This is where people get. So you're right. The black hole will be, I don't know, 20 billion. Let's say. Yeah. It will be bigger than it was in March because I think I'm right in recollecting from one of the OBR's joyous fiscal manuals that I think 0.1 percentage point of medium-term growth is 10 billion.
Right. Sounds about right.
Right. So it doesn't take very much off their medium-term growth outlook to create quite a big revenue gap. And as you say, the rise in 30-year gilt is not something the government will be particularly happy about. I wonder if, one of the reasons they haven't yet announced a budget date is because they would like the OBR to be locking in the most favourable gilt curve to their forecast that they can possibly find. And who would blame them, frankly, for that? I think... But as we know, like 10 billion, 20 billion is nothing in the context of the public finances. It matters to markets who are maxed out, and like any extra 10 or 20 billion that the government is going to come to them for, they are very, very sensitive right now, both in relation to the sustainability of UK government debt, but also because we are strangely coupled to the US, and the US is making some interesting policy choices, shall we say, which are having ramifications for us. Plus, of course, we are a bit diverged from the advanced world in terms of our inflation level and outlook. So others are on a downward path for interest rates. We may have run out of steam on that and may be heading for a plateau. So there are a few things which aren't doing great. I think that where people get particularly pessimistic is like trying to work out a direction of travel and work out likelihood versus optimism. And they look at, we've got a new government still. They've only been in a year from a party that hasn't been in power for a lot of years. So there's not a lot of data, as we economists would say, to build out a nice forecast of. So you're left with what they've done to date. And what they've done to date has not been growth friendly. That is a reality. It hasn't been. It doesn't on a net basis. That doesn't mean there haven't been bits of growth friendly stuff. There's planning reform in train. There's those strategies which businesses were so keen on seeing sort of better longevity and predictability in government policy. So the fact that they delivered those, that's absolutely brilliant. If they can stick to those. Great. The challenge has been, but what they've actually done is completely in opposition to that. And again, the narrative in these quietish summer months has been, what taxes can we levy on the private sector next? Because we've decided that curtailing elements of public sector spending is too hard politically. And so inevitably, coming back to what we were agreeing earlier, you transfer money from the private to the public, particularly in the current state of affairs, and you get weaker growth. And people are looking at it and they're going, you seem to be planning to do more of that. We're going to get weaker growth. That's going to lead to less sustainable public finances. And I know, August is a thin month for markets because people are on leave, so they can be a bit choppy in August, but there'll be a bit of that concern underpinning things as well. And of course, because, Parliament is in recess, you haven't got ministers on the front foot doing the strong messaging to the degree you wouldn't otherwise that you would otherwise have. So I think, come September, it will be interesting to see how, the government responds strategically to some of these challenges, which can be dealt with through messaging to a degree.
I mean, where do you expect the government to try and raise taxes in the budget? Do you have any preferences?
Well, ideally, I'd be just dealing with welfare, and particularly welfare fraud, because benefit fraud, it does seem that the benefit system is under a bit of systematic attack from fraudsters, and addressing that would make sense. So I think
help reset incentives as well in some very important ways.
Logically, I mean, I know they've relaunched a pension commission, but I think the pension triple lock has done what it was intended to do, which was raise pensioners' incomes up to a more comparable rate with other income groups.
But it embeds inflation while doing it as well, which I think is really important.
Exactly. It's done its job. It's been more expensive than predicted. It isn't affordable long term, so it's time to part ways with it and find a different way for ensuring that pension incomes move up in the right way and an affordable way. If I'm going to accept tax increases, though, I mean, the obvious and logical one is the income tax threshold freeze. Nobody likes it, but it spreads the burden as widely as possible, so it can be felt as least as possible. I think I would also not freeze fuel duty again, because although it is always really popular, and it was really popular with our members as well, so apologies to them. Economically, it's, 4 billion, 5 billion pounds? We don't need to find that. So I would let that go up and start us on the pathway to road pricing as we move to electric vehicles.
Would you violate any of the election promises to not raise VAT, income taxes, or employee NI?
Well, they've already done NI. Frankly, it's a difficult one. I mean, to be honest, that's not really our bag, is it? I mean, I think they should look at what is VATable. We know we've got a really narrow VAT base. Yep. We know it is out of alignment with what's typically the case in Europe. They should look at bringing more items into the VAT base, but also look at the process. Because one thing that government and indeed economists to a degree aren't particularly good at looking at is how to get to the most optimal scenario, particularly on tax. It's like we're good at going, okay, an optimal tax system looks like this. You tax things that don't move around much the most. Hence why they're looking at houses, which I wouldn't advocate taxing labour mobility more, certainly at this point.
Where should the taxes fall if they're going to?
Yeah.
And you mentioned fuel and the broadening of the VAT base.
Yeah. So the broadening on the VAT base, that's the obvious one. And I know Tim Leung, is it? Is that how you pronounce his name? He's done a piece on broadening the VAT base, which I've not yet looked at to consider feasibility and how you'd actually transition, because ultimately the transition is incredibly important and the messaging. But that would be logical. That doesn't breach any election promise either. So I think there's a lot they can do without doing that. I
mean, my take on what you've just said is, and I think I agree with you actually, is that you can quite easily do, say, 20-25 billion either side on tax and spend and get public finances in a fairly safe place very quickly. It's not that difficult, and you wouldn't get much opposition from economists basically across the spectrum. And of course, the market for bad news is always high in the UK. So the press would write what they write, but actually within a couple of months, you'd find the market would calm down a little bit. So I think that's right. When we think about the UK much further out, and the UK, I should add, is just not. It's not on its own here. The whole of the advanced world with an aging demographic is in the same boat. You have this long-term structural increase in spending, welfare, pensions, which, based on the OBR's projections, will increase UK public debt as a percent of GDP by a factor of 3, basically. What is it? 80% now, we get to 250%, yeah, roughly a factor of 3. The rest of the advanced world is in a similar situation. Japan's given us an idea of where many of us are heading. What sort of treatment do we need to fix those kind of problems? That goes well beyond just fiddling with a 5-year budget.
Absolutely. And this is, I think, just before we move on to the long term, the challenge with the budget cycle and the fiscal rules is you just end up with a bunch of short term tinkering with the numbers, and that becomes your long term policy, and you never actually do the things which take longer but do actually deliver that sustainability. Whereas, as various commentators, I think the Economics Observatory in particular, have noted, we've had a bunch of fiscal rules and our debt has continued to rise. They haven't done anything to constrain matters.
I'm glad you've mentioned that. So I would actually just preface my question by just saying something different, which is to say, would you agree that if we could seriously tackle the risks associated with the long-term structural increase in the debt, we, businesses, markets, government wouldn't have to sweat over 10, 20 billion every 6 months?
I think under the right circumstances, yes. But of course, the right circumstances, you need to create them first. You need a little bit of space to enable you to just look through the short-term shocks, so that you can play the long game. And that is a challenge which previous governments have struggled with. Mm-hmm. Gordon Brown certainly did, in terms of his budget rules. And we are struggling with now, because everything, as we have discussed, is about, is it 10 billion, is it 20 billion, is it 30 billion? But the way the public sector debt is heading, we're going to be, this is peanuts.
And judging by the state of the world, the frequency of shocks and the uncertainty and the like there's never going to be, well, never saying never, but it seems unreasonable to assume that we're heading into a 2 or 3 year quiet period where you'll just get pretty good economic growth and everything will be fine. There'll be no shocks in the world, and then you'll be able to make the argument to try and deal with a long-term problem. In the end, at some point, either we bite the bullet ourselves, or the market forces us and the rest of the advanced world to bite the bullet.
Yeah. I mean, this is absolutely it. I think, of course, as we know, one of the challenges from the direction of travel for demographics is both sort of the health pressures that come with it, but also pension affordability, when state pensions are based off the ability to pay of current taxpayers rather than being investment based. So that is a baked-in challenge. It's not one we have to stick with, of course. But if we choose to, then we need to get everyone else's, the working population, which will be smaller, needs to have way more productivity and deliver way more tax revenue than it currently is. Hence, which comes back to the biggest medium-term economic challenge for the UK is addressing investments and capital, because there's been plenty of analysis looking at and quantifying how poor our capital stock is compared to comparators, how poor the rate of improvement in it is, both within the private sector and public sector. And it is to the government's credit, they have, one of the first things they did was put money back into capital budgets. It doesn't move the dial, especially, unfortunately. It merely puts back in what was going to be leaving a budget. So you're looking at sort of plateauing. But it is good that they've done that, and it is good that they are doing various other things to try and support the investment environment in the UK. But what we're still missing is the sort of same shock and awe tactics that would support a really big turnaround in investment, which we kind of got, but the opposite way in last year's budget, which was a big budget. As the OBR said, it's the biggest budget outside of peacetime.
That's right. Yeah.
The loosest.
It was a big budget.
Yeah, the loosest fiscal rules ever.
Yep.
And the fact that we've only had a quite gentle climb in borrowing costs is quite actually, should have done quite a good job actually on fiscal stability against that. quite stark backdrop. But we need that kind of shock and awe to really sort of give things a kick, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to deliver small-scale incremental changes over the years, given, as you say, we're not looking like we're heading for calmer waters.
That's right. So of course, the situation is difficult, and there's, of course, a lot of focus on tax and spend because we have a budget coming up. I mean, to what extent do you think the UK could just radically deregulate and just open up major parts of the economy that are overregulated? This is, at least when I speak to businesses, the other thing in addition to taxes that they say, actually, it's just very difficult to do business these days. So the weight of regulation has just been growing and growing and compounding. And of course, again, it's economists always seem to say this kind of thing, but actually it's basically recognized across the advanced world. You have the Draghi report in Europe, which says, okay, we've completely overregulated ourselves. America has sort of taken piecemeal steps to address it, but not really, actually. Like, if you look at the Cato Institute stuff on the first Donald Trump presidency, they say they didn't really do as much as we had anticipated, and the effects were quite small. At least anecdotally, we have instances in the UK. We work in financial services, or you speak to people that work in energy or manufacturing. They're just running up against regulations. Is this the kind of thing you hear from businesses as well? I mean, do you think we're just wasting our time discussing fiscal policy? Actually, should we just say, let's get out of this siloed debate. Let's just see where we can open things up through deregulation.
I mean, deregulation, it does represent a major opportunity. I mean, I'll wrap into that tax complexity as well, absent the level of tax, because the complexity of our system is quite insane. We've got the longest tax code in the world. Yep. Every time they clamp down on avoidance, that's another layer of tax complexity. Yep. You need people to take a step back and look at what they're trying to achieve over 5-10 years and be right it all. With regulation, the planning reform, is like a good example here. Both in terms of opportunity, but also in terms of challenge, because of course you've already got the interest groups, the environmentalists, who are set to be the losers in planning reform, because there will be fewer requirements to respond to their request to demonstrate that you have protected whatever wildlife they are most concerned about arising from particular infrastructure plans. There'll be fewer opportunities for them to challenge as well. And we know, of course, that planning obstacles are a big part of the UK's investment challenge, housing challenge, infrastructure delivery challenge. There's a huge opportunity there. We know our system takes many, many more years to clear things than any comparable equivalent country. But actually delivering it is the hard thing. It requires a complete mindset change, and it requires the courage to go to the environmentalists. Yes, I hear what you say and I sympathise, but this actually has to, you're going to lose here.
It's why so much gets gold-plated, isn't it? Yeah. Just because it's the only way to get things through.
Everyone wants to be nice, and of course we all want to be nice, and we all want to put health and safety and the environment first, and rightly so. The health and safety comes to mind just because driving around the UK, as one does in the summer, the roadworks, the lengths of motorway which are cordoned off, but nothing is happening, or the temporary traffic lights I have sat up, which are making you take turns, but nothing is actually happening. These are regulatory costs to the economy, incurred by everybody. Who is quantifying them and deciding that these huge stretches of road need to be cordoned off when nothing is happening? Whereas, for example, you go to Italy and they cordon off a much shorter stretch.
Or the US.
Anywhere else. They shut off much less. And of course, somebody has gone, well, the risks can be so much lower. And it's like, and that's the 30 mph, 20 mph discussion as well. But there are costs, and those costs, are probably exponential.
Yep. And even if the trade-offs are hidden, the trade-offs are absolutely there. And I think that's absolutely right. So the podcast, I tried to finish with 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, what's the thing that we should be talking about on the UK that we're not? And then the second is, where can people find you if they want to listen to more, to read more, to see more?
Well, the first thing we should be talking about is benefit reform. Everyone's stopped talking about it. Everyone's given up. But the bit of public spending we should be talking about is the bit which was not covered by the spending review, which is more than half of public sector spending. So we really need to actually not take that one off the table.
I should just add that just to complete the other side of that. So about half of government spending is really not being touched, as you mentioned. And then when it comes to taxes, VAT, income tax, and employee national insurance is close to 2/3 of the tax base. So when we have a discussion about fiscal policy, we're really not having a discussion about fiscal policy, are we? We're having a discussion about choices on half of spending and 1/3 of taxation.
Yeah.
And so in an already constrained debate, we then have these self-imposed constraints.
Absolutely.
Which make things even more hard.
Yeah, and you're right. We should take the shackles off because, the UK economy has enough challenges already.
Yeah, exactly.
Self-inflicted shackles are not something we should be choosing.
When you have so few choices, don't remove choices.
Exactly. Particularly not voluntarily.
That's right.
It's bad enough when they're imposed on us, but let's not add them. Yes, if people want to hear from me or see stuff that I'm putting out, obviously I'm on LinkedIn with all the great and the good. You can find us on our IoD web pages, iod.com. Our press releases are all out there, and occasionally I turn up in the media like your good self.
Thank you. Yeah, excellent. Well, Anna, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. Anna Leach, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.